Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome. It's another Sunday, fine Sunday. It's 4 o'clock. It's time for a live stream here. As always, if you're listening on Instagram Live, you are absolutely welcome to jump in to the lecture hall Zoom meeting. Feel free to go to my page, click the link in my bio. From the link in my bio, you will be able to jump into the Zoom session. You can see everything uh, that we that we have going on. Essentially, the link tree thing. I'm sorry, I'm a little frazzled. I had like this big meal, okay, and I've got like the itis, and now I'm like working through the itis to keep all this stuff up. Thank you guys so much for the congratulations. Yeah, our daughter came about 2 weeks early, I suppose. So um, that's been fun. Things have shifted around. I have to like grade midterms after this. I'm like juggling a bunch of things, but life is lifing and I'm okay. We're keeping through this. But please, just a friendly reminder before we get started. If you're watching on YouTube, please hit the like and subscribe button, comment, do something to help me out in terms of engagement. If you're listening on IG Live, you're welcome to continue listening on IG Live. You can see the slides on by clicking the link in my bio, and then somewhere in the mix of it all, while we're live streaming during the Q&A portion, you're welcome to chime in, ask me questions. If for whatever reason the IG Live stays up beyond an hour, I will be paying attention to the feed. Okay. Sue C, you'll have to forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that, asks, what's the topic for today? We have been doing a review of an African American Studies collegiate textbook that is no longer in print, and I have been telling people the timeline of American history, including the parts of history that they have not learned in school. Basically leading up to the race politics that we know of today. It gives you basically a full idea of how we even got here. Okay. And so this week's topic, we're talking about the chapter is called Let Your Motto Be Resistance, but what does that actually mean? Well, in this chapter, we're going to be doing a deep dive into the analysis of the different kinds of resistance movements that existed in the pre-Civil War America. Okay. Because as we've already established in our review of the last chapter last week, is that the people who were pro-abolition were not necessarily pro-abolition for the same reasons. So among those people who are like abolitionists, like absolutely against slavery, these events contribute directly to what leads to the Civil War. We'll be talking about that today, but I need to preface with this before we get started. I'm sorry I'm taking a little longer than usual to get started. Um, I need to preface with this. My review of this chapter jumps between periods of history, like years back and forth. It's very difficult to talk about the cultural context in a certain order and keep things kind of like sequentially ordered too. Um, so you'll just have to keep in mind that like as I'm jumping back and forth, I need you to give me the grace of thinking about these ideas in terms of like periods in time rather than, well, in the last two slides he was talking about 1850, but now we're talking about 1829, and like why is he jumping back and forth? Just kind of keep that in mind for me, okay? It really is. Just honestly, it's difficult to talk about it in that way. But let's go ahead. Let's get started here because we have a lot to cover. Okay. The first thing I want to get started with covering is that by the time you're in smack dab into the middle of the 1800s, again, pre-Civil War America, okay, we're talking about a period where you have mainly white Americans here who are like hardcore leaning into this idea that like this land is theirs. God entitles them to this land. Not only are they racially superior, they're culturally superior, they're politically superior, they're nationalistically superior, and they feel a sense of entitlement to taking control of the land, even going so far as to wage war or specific logistical conflicts with their Spanish neighbors. Keep in mind that the Spanish own a significant part of what we now know today as, the continental U.S. Okay. But right now, white entitlement, and by white entitlement, I'm talking about white English speaking people in America who are descendants of those colonizers, now are like, no, we're going to take this land by any means necessary. Okay. And so what you have is there's growing toxicity here. And the toxicity is that while you have these white Americans that feel entitled to land, to freedom, to ownership of other people, and to take those things by any means necessary, I've already established for you in the last few weeks that they are engaging in violence, acts of violence, sometimes riots, days long riots. They're willing to kill people for the sake of their own political values. So, what you have in response to that, like growing manifest destiny violence, on one end, is kind of responded to, in part reciprocated by the abolitionists on the other end. You have abolitionists that are becoming more militant and more willing to lean into violence, um, because they believe as fervently in their own political values as these white supremacist people do, these white nationalists, if you will. Okay, so what's happening, as we've already established, is butting of heads on both political sides, whether that's the pro-slavery side or the anti-slavery side, that is festering over into a toxicity, a norm of violence. Okay. At the same time, I think we already established this several weeks ago, but I'm kind of reminding you of the cultural context here. Is at the same time that you have Manifest Destiny is in part being fueled by a scientific movement, a kind of wave, if you will, of scientific racism that is positioning American whites as being the apex of humanity. In that there is, in fact, a racial hierarchy, but within that racial hierarchy, excuse me, within that racial hierarchy, where you have white Americans as the apex of human civilization and achievement, European immigrants are somehow a lesser evolved form, and then Negroes or niggers all the way at the bottom. There is a natural racial hierarchy. And on this notion, it is fueling this idea that white people really are entitled to take advantage and exploit the opportunities that God is giving them by claiming ownership of the land. And so what's being reinforced, as we've already talked about here, is that it's reinforcing these ideas of intrinsic racial difference, and those intrinsic racial differences being that racial differences are distinct, and what makes one race useful in one regard makes another race useful in a completely different regard, thereby positioning American whites as being the apex of civilization. Okay, so you have now where it's not just a political sentiment in reference to Manifest Destiny concerning the expansion of U.S. territories and colonies westward, but you also have a scientifically justified basis on which Europeans, or not Europeans, excuse me, but American whites are then willing to engage in violence if it means that they can enact and actualize these beliefs that they know to be true. Okay. Another friendly reminder, we've kind of talked about this already, so I'm kind of going through what we've already discussed this, okay? But essentially, smack dab in the middle of this period is a political movement in which these white Americans are also frustrated by the reality that after only a few amount of years, these European immigrants that just got fresh off of the boat. They haven't been here as long as these white Americans. They're bringing their European languages, cultural customs, religious ideologies. They're kind of separatists in a way. They get entitled to the same rights and freedoms as these white Americans where they're allowed to vote. And these European immigrants largely have anti slavery sentiments. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean racial equity sentiments or racial equality sentiments, but they feel like slavery is an abhorrent institution. Right. From which then it's creating political tensions in which what we know to be a real American or a real patriot is going to be somebody who's pro slavery, right? Somebody who's pro racial inequality, who's a white supremacist who understands that American whites are the apex of civilization, and now you have these like lesser evolved forms of man that somehow get the same rights and privileges that you do, and then they're like tarnishing the American way of life. right? So keep in mind that like all of these things are happening at the same time. I've already established for you additionally that there was a wave, well, was, but a wave of riots, um, genocides, slaughters, displacements. All of these things are going on simultaneously. And like I said, I want you to consider these things in the scope of like just a review of the general period in time, because the moment I start jumping back and forth, if you're so beholden to the specific year, you're going to wonder, like, why is he jumping back and forth? He was talking about 1840s in the last slide, but now we're talking about 1829. And like, why is he jumping around? Because in general, the cultural climate, let's say during at least the first 50 years or so of the 1800s, is a climate in which you have a group of white people who feel entitled to be able to engage in violence and not expect any like retaliation. Okay. On the other side, because you have people who are the recipients of violence, feel that it's necessary to then reciprocate that violence. And so then in reciprocating that violence, it's reinforcing a kind of toxic political climate. Now, essentially, it's the patriots versus the insurrectionists. It's the abolitionists versus the pro-slavery. No matter what language you use, the point is that it's inherently divisive. And it's so divisive that Congress now has this responsibility, because the British can exploit this, is essentially that we have this like polarized division in American society in which you can't really find a middle ground to satisfy people or groups of people on both sides. Even though we're all supposed to be collectively Americans, Congress now has the responsibility to try to resolve this toxicity, and their best attempts to do so is just to try to give both sides what they want. Okay. And in giving both sides what they want, it means then that you'll have slave states, but then you'll also have free states. And in trying to satisfy both sides, neither side is satisfied because they don't want the other side to have the privileges that the other side actually wants. Okay. So the anti slavery side wants slavery to end, which is going to then piss off the slaveholders. Okay. The slaveholders identify in their cultural customs, their way of life, that owning human beings as property and being able to do with them what they want to, go wherever they want, is a freedom and a fundamental American right that the government should not impose its influence on. So how dare these abolitionists tell us that we can't have slaves and blah, blah, blah. And now Congress goes, well, how can we satisfy both sides? You can see how that is inherently amplifying the division. Okay. So now here's where we get to westward expansion. Again, forgive me for jumping back and forth. Is by 1822, you have this interesting phenomenon, which I won't go into the expansive details about. However, Mexico has successfully gained independence from Spain. Okay, and in gaining independence from Spain, only 7 years later is now the country of Mexico abolishing slavery within its borders. Part of the reason why it's abolishing slavery is because um, the Mexican government has recognized that the institution of slavery is, in fact, a kind of abhorrent. And if we want to find our values in accordance with notions of European enlightenment, that it's probably best for us to kind of settle the debate around slavery, especially since you have competitor nations that can exploit slavery as a selective weakness to impose influence on these lands. It's probably best that we resolve the issue of slavery by simply doing away with it. Okay. So by 1829, here's Mexico that's abolishing slavery within its borders. Now, part of Mexico in 1829, let me get my mouse here. Hopefully, you can see my mouse. Is part of Mexico right here is this red area and the orange area. Okay. So what was once Spanish-owned territory, Mexico has now gained independence, and they own these regions. Now, within these regions, okay, you have a group of white people that now feel entitled to all of this land. And they're going to take it by any means necessary. It doesn't matter how, it doesn't matter when, but God is willing their ownership and their control of this land. And they're going to do with it whatever they want to, including taking it. And it doesn't matter what laws are erected, what borders are in place. They don't care, but they know it's there, so they're going to move in. This is kind of like I suppose a modern parallel that comes to mind, at least on my own right now, are the Zionists in Israel. I don't know if you've seen these videos of these Zionists that feel like that land, and they're like pointing to it several yards away. Um, but that land over there is ours, and we're going to move in. And you have people that just move in and start displacing people, even though they're like preemptively jumping over a border and things like that. It's kind of like that. Stephen Bowman says, "What treaties are made?" We're going to talk about treaties in just a second. We're just not really there yet. Sorry. Just give me a moment. Um, but having said that, right, my point is that there is this like almost like a pressure cooker, if you will, of like entitlement that is bubbling up to the surface and it's beginning to spill over into these areas well before we get into the idea or the topic of annexation. And so, because the country of Mexico, where did my mouse go? There it is. Sorry, let me go back for a second. And so, because the country of Mexico has abolished slavery, it now has this interesting phenomenon, okay? Because you have Americans that are now settling in Texas or Tejas before it ever belonged to America. They already feel entitled to the land. So they're just taking their slaves and they're going, hey, look at all this open land. It's going to be ours anyway. May as well just take it for the taking. It doesn't matter. Jump across the border, migrate illegally, right? Do your undocumented dance, do whatever it is, but illegally immigrate over into these lands that don't belong to you and then lay claim to it for yourself because eventually it would be yours. That's the way that God wills it. Okay. So they're bringing their slaves with them. Okay, they're bringing their plantations, their wealth, their way of life. They're looking for new niches to fill in these regions. And so what's happening is there's an interesting admixture of white American slaveholders that are also mixing with the Spanish speakers that still inhabit these lands. They're trading slaves. They're kind of normalizing slave owning culture during this period in time. Okay. So by 1836, okay, now you have the region of Texas, this red region right here, that has like a normalized culture of slave trading and industries around slave labor. And because the Mexican government has technically outlawed slavery, you have people that don't want to follow those laws. They have no interest in how if they are reaping the benefits of owning slaves economically, logistically, sexually, whatever ways you want to consider, why is that now something that they want to give up? Okay. So now Texas is faced with this unique thing where they're saying, hey, what if we just seceded from Mexico and we just said we wanted to apply for annexation to the US because we want to be a part of the US, and in being a part of the US, we can legally keep the institution of slavery in place in these red regions, and we can stay law-abiding citizens. We can have our laws in place, but we can also keep our culture of slavery too. Okay. Excuse me. So essentially by 1836, that's what's happening is Tejas secedes from Mexico and just basically raises its hand and says, hey, US, we're up for the taking. We know you want this land anyway, so come and get it. Okay. And in coming to get it, essentially Texas, there's a war because there's going to be a dispute over this, but essentially the US is eager to take over Texas. And in taking over Texas by 1844, James Polk, okay, who was a Democrat president. Again, during this period in time, the Democrats are not the same Democrats that we know today. Politically speaking, they are more aligned with what we would call conservative politics. Okay. But regardless, this Democrat presidential candidate is essentially leaning into this idea that if he's elected president, he's going to move forward on the annexation of not just Texas, but also Oregon, because he's politically embodying the philosophy, the idea of manifest destiny. That's ultimately what makes him popular, not just among Democrats during this time period, but even during the Republic era. Is even though you have people that are disputing about slavery, there are lots of people who are in agreement with this idea that we need to own the land from coast to coast. Okay, so Polk essentially is elected president because again, during this time period, the Whigs can't figure out their own political standing during this period in time. So essentially, the year after Polk is elected, Congress is annexing Texas. And in annexing Texas, they incorporate Texas as a fundamental part of the United States. But now the United States still has this functional issue. And the functional issue it has is you have to satisfy both sides. We know that Texas wants to maintain slavery, but we do have to balance out our slave states with free states because we want to make sure that we can try to prevent to our best ability another slave uprising that is inspired by the British and other Black liberation sympathizers. Okay, so in annexing Texas, we're now faced with this debate. Okay, and the debate is how are we going to divvy up Texas in such a way that we can satisfy the pro-slavery side and satisfy the anti-slavery side. And if we can kind of figure out a way to find that middle ground, that's where we're going to find the sweet spot. At least that's what their thinking is during this period in time. Okay. So naturally, then you have debates, and the debates are in part rhetorical. I would go so far as to say they're not just debates, it's also like physical violence and contention too. But the point is that you have toxicity on both sides that's amplifying this conflict. Okay. So on the north end, in the industrial north, where they mainly embody the politics of anti slavery, and again, we've already covered this for different reasons. Okay. They're afraid that the region of Texas is so large that no matter what way you try to divide it, the pro slavery side is going to have too much political power and representation in the future that would essentially render anti slavery political movements kaput, right? While the South is essentially becoming fearful that if in whatever way they take the entire region of Texas and cut off even a sliver of it and say that this is a free district, essentially you're excluding all slaveholders from being able to inhabit certain lands. Okay. So on its own, the annexation of Texas is kind of amplifying the country's growing direction towards a civil war. And it's unbeknownst to these people during these times. None of the decisions they're making are going, well, we're going to end up in a civil war, 15 years from now. Better do what we can to speed it up. It's just more like that no matter what Congress does to try to satisfy both sides, it really just amplifies the tension. Okay. So, in addition to that, not only do you get the annexation of Texas, and then eventually the annexation of the Oregon Territory too, but only 3 years later is Mexico, kind of due to, let's say, militaristic pressure, but also political pressure. Okay. Um, they are essentially seceding control of what we know to be California all the way over to like New Mexico, or what we now call New Mexico, that entire region. They just essentially give it up because tactically they can't compete with the United States, but also you have a number of Mexican or former Mexican Texans that are also like heavily invested in the institution of slavery and have already seceded from Mexico and are willing to support the United States in its expansion efforts, which essentially means that the US has a leg up militaristically, tactically, numerically, whatever ways you want to consider, that it's just in the Mexican government's own best interest not even to resist. There's no point in losing life here. These people are entitled to the land. We can't really resist it. You can kind of just give it up. Okay. I think the treaty for this is somebody please fact check me on this because my memory is kind of shoddy. And I thought I had a slide on this. Maybe I'm thinking a little ahead, but I think it's called the Treaty of Hidalgo, something like that. If you want to chime in the chat, someone is welcome to kind of chime in with some background information around the Treaty of Hidalgo. The name Hidalgo comes to mind, but I'm sorry, I'm a little shoddy. I'm still digesting my food. I kind of got the itis. But if someone can chime in with some background information about the reason for why Mexico ultimately just seceded California to New Mexico, we can kind of just we'll put it on the chat there. But essentially, that's what's happening. So with the debates around whether we're going to determine here we go. Stephen Bowman, thank you so much. Signed on February 2nd in 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. There you go. Ended the Mexican-American War. Mexico seceded 50%, 55% of its territory, including present-day California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming to the U.S. for 15 million and assumption of claims. Yeah, that sounds about right. The Rio Grande was set as the Texas border, significantly expanding U.S. territory. There you go. Yeah, there you go. Okay. Um, but essentially they just kind of gave it up. It was like you don't compare, and you don't compare when you have a sizable number of people that inhabit this region that are willing to turn against you. It's not worth it. um so that's what happens, is they essentially give it up. So essentially within a 3-year span, let's say 4 years to be generous, essentially you have the acquisition of this eastern part of Texas all the way to the west coast of what we now know to be the continental United States. Okay. So now that you have this expansion and it goes over within a 3-year period, now you have a bunch of slaveholders that are so eager. They're like, "Low, yo, we have this new territory. We can go and expand. You can create new niches. We're not restricted in this regard. Fuck the US government. They're not going to tell us where we can and can't go with our slaves. We're just going to take this." Meanwhile, you have anti-slavery people that are going, no, 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 wait, 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 hold on. We can't do this. We can't keep going on this thing where we're going to expand slavery. We're going to threaten the economic security of white working families. And it's just not fair. You need fair representation. And if you truly care about US democracy, you're going to find a way to divvy this up, but not just divvy it up, end the expansion of slavery. Okay. And then ending the expansion of slavery, essentially the best they can get is to pressure Congress to go, okay, we'll say that this region of Texas, which is already has a bunch of slaves, that's going to be a slave district. That's the image that you see here. We're going to call this the slave district. And then from the northern panhandle of what we're calling Texas, we'll keep the name here. From this region onward, we'll designate this as a free district. Okay. So the slaveholders are pissed off too. Well, hey, but now essentially you're telling me I can't bring my slaves up to this era. I can't find a niche for myself in this area. I'm prohibited from being. This is not real freedom. So no matter what Congress does, it's just angering both sides. Okay. So by 1850, we have all of this land now. You have angry people on both sides. It's politically polarized. It's the worst it's ever been. Okay. Congress passes what they call the Compromise of 1850. And essentially, they're trying to position it as a compromise. It isn't. Okay. But the point is, they're attempting to satisfy both sides. And in trying to satisfy both sides, they try to erect 5 laws that deal with territorial expansion and who gets access or where they get access to slaves and where they don't. Okay. So, in order to satisfy the anti slavery side, they say by 1850, we're going to suppress slave trade in DC, meaning they're saying we are no longer importing slaves from Africa because by this point in time, technically you don't need to. You have such a large number of enslaved Black people within these lands that their population is entirely self sufficient for being able to selectively breed them on their own. So, this move to try to suppress the slave trade in DC is essentially symbolic. Okay. It's saying, hey, we're gonna end the transatlantic slave trade and the anti-slavery side. They can be kind of satisfied and call this a victory if they want. In essence, it doesn't really do anything. Okay. Then they say, okay, in the region that we're calling California, which was already called California by the former country of Mexico, we're going to admit California to the Union, And California will be a sizable state that is comparable to the size of Texas, but is a free state. Okay. So now this is where you get why Texas is as large as California, certainly in comparison to the Electoral College, but just on the map, these are the two largest states in the continental US. And their politics still, for the most part, embody the political divide of what existed in pre-Civil War America, which is that Texas embodies the politics of the slaveholding proletariat, right? And or the bourgeoisie, not the proletariat. And then California is that liberal progressive state that tries to position itself as a free state, but certainly doesn't actually enforce any of those laws. But this is how we get California essentially becoming a blue state today, and then Texas becoming a red state, and they kind of historically stay that way. Although there are some decades where California was a red state, we could go back and forth on the intricacies of that. In general, California is established as a free state. Okay. The third law here is they say, all right, we're going to establish a territorial government in a state that we're calling Utah. And that territorial government will be responsible for figuring out for itself whether it wants to be a free state or a slave state. So Congress is essentially saying, to some extent, we're going to reach our arms and we're going to say, this is a slave state, this is a free state, and the American people get to decide for themselves whether they want this region to be a free state or a slave state entirely on its own. So Congress is essentially trying to do its best to balance the political divide here, if that makes sense. Okay. They also say, in order to satisfy the pro slavery end, however, we are going to try to increase the powers of the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act, for those of you who don't know, are the laws that regulate being able to go and reclaim your slave as property if they cross state lines because they fled and they were trying to get away. You can appoint bounty hunters, you can appoint a sheriff, you can appoint whoever you want to go and track your slave down across state lines, even in free states, and go reclaim your property and bring them back to where they rightfully belong. Rightfully belong. Okay. So, like I said, it's a balancing act where Congress is really trying to find a way to go, hey, we're making an effort to satisfy the anti-slavery end, and we're going to give you this. We're also making an effort to satisfy the pro-slavery end, and we're going to give you this, and we're giving you the freedom to decide for yourself what direction you want to take the country with regards to this land. Okay. And then they say this is kind of neither here nor there, but they're drawing the boundaries around what they consider to be legally Texas and then legally Oklahoma and Nebraska and Utah and all of that stuff. Okay. So essentially, the Compromise of 1850 is doing this really delicate balancing act that's kind of nonsensical in a way, but they're doing their best to just kind of satisfy both sides. Now, having said that, what does that have to do with the anti-slavery movement? Wasn't this chapter about the people of the anti-slavery movement and what they were doing? Yes. So now that you have the historical context around what's going on politically regarding the expansion of slavery with the acquisition of new territories, you now have this problem, okay? Where I already said to you that you have a group of entitled white people who already know that they're laying claim to land that God has willed for them to have and are doing whatever they need to do, including fighting or engaging in violence against the people who are the most resistant to it. Okay. So on the anti slavery movement, and you have a lot of people who are really trying their best to be peaceful about how they resist the expansion of slavery, but they're being met with lots of vigilante violence, terrorist attacks. Their churches are getting bombed. I don't want to go so far as to say bombed, maybe like lit ablaze, right? You have these terrorist attacks. In certain cases, it becomes so volatile that you really do have like mass shootings. Hint, hint, believe it or not, like angry politically partisan people who just go into a place where they know their opponents exist and just like kill them. Elena says, when they expanded, I wonder what there were counting on when they tried to satisfy everyone. Greed, imperialistic ambitions, why be bigger? Well, okay, so we kind of talked about this already, but we've covered so much. I'm going to remind you the thing that they're counting on is this idea of trying to be true two notions of democracy, right? Um, Part of trying to be true to the democratic system that they've erected is in response to the tyrannical monarchical rule in history from the rule of King George and the British monarchy. And politically speaking, the US government is trying its best to be honest and earnest about being democratically sophisticated in this regard. Okay. Now, despite that, among the constituencies, you have people who are so diametrically opposed on one fundamental issue that Congress is going to be the locus of their conflict because Congress is ultimately the governmental body that has the political say so, the power to be able to legislate a definitive response. But now, because Congress, as a governmental body, is trying to do its best to embody and represent the political values and aspirations of all Americans, the best strategy that they can come up with is try to satisfy everybody. Give everybody a little bit of what they want, right? So maybe you don't go all the way with giving all of the pro slavery people all of the things that they're demanding, but you do your best to just give them a little bit of what they want. On the anti slavery end, you don't give them everything that they're asking for, but you give them, do your best to give them a little bit of what they want. And then because you're trying to be honest about giving the power to the people, you let the people decide what direction they want to go through or go towards democratically. Okay. And so again, even though like on paper, like conceptually, that makes sense, it might be the best approach. In reality, it's actually just amplifying the tension because the reality is both sides are essentially all or nothing. Okay. The pro slavery side is pro slavery everywhere. And if we don't get pro slavery everywhere, we're dissatisfied. The anti slavery end is anti slavery everywhere. And if they don't get what they want, they're not satisfied. Now, then Congress decides, well, you're going to vote on whether this state is going to be pro slavery, anti slavery. And you have people that have been holding their volatile contentions, in some cases, have already been violently lashing out, that you can only then imagine the toxicity that's going on where they have to vote about it. Okay. Thank you. But how is annexing Mexico territories democratic? Well, annexing territories is not necessarily democratic, but these people already felt entitled to this land and were going to get it no matter what. Okay. And because of the complex history of slave trades within the region of Texas, there was a sizable majority of Texas that wanted to keep slave laws in place and so left Mexico. It just becomes a thing where it's like, it's very complicated is the simple answer, right? Um, you say they're pro-slavery everywhere, so they don't want California. Well, yes, right. But the pro-slavery people want slavery in these new territories. The anti-slavery people don't want slavery anywhere. And so it just becomes a thing where if you're trying to do your best to represent everybody's interest, how you just can't. Functionally, it's impossible. Right. Good. Okay, great. Okay. So now you have people, you've got vigilantes that are lashing out, they're engaging in terrorist attacks, racial terror, and even attacking the people that are abolitionists. And so the abolitionists who want to be peaceful are like, look, I go out in the streets, I get attacked. One of our newspaper buildings just got lit up ablaze, and a bunch of people died inside that building because these pro slavery people went out and lashed against us. How peaceful can we be if we're constantly getting hit in the face? Maybe we need to hit back. Okay. Okay. Yeah, thanks, Brent. But also, Brent, hopefully that clarifies for you too. Um, okay, so you have people now. We already talked about who William Lloyd Garrison was last week. His image is this white guy in the middle here. He was absolutely fundamentally against the institution of slavery. He was a die-hard abolitionist through and through. His political aspirations never shook. Now, having said that, William Lloyd Garrison really did try to mobilize what he could to challenge, to challenge pro-slavery wherever he could. Okay, so he's leading an abolitionist newspaper. That abolitionist newspaper is being funded mainly by black people, let's say freed black people or newly freed black people who have very little money but are trying to spread their message across the country. Okay, but the problem here is a little bit embedded in the social politics of the fact that a white man is essentially at the helm of leading an abolitionist movement. And although you could say to some extent that, like, William Lloyd Garrison is absolutely 100% down for the cause, the reality to some extent is that shouldn't this movement still fundamentally give power to Black people? Like, have them be the leaders, have them be the ones speaking from experience rather than having a white man speak for us, even if that white man really is down for us. And so Garrison then becomes a kind of point of contention here because he wants to lead the charge. And I can't say, I didn't know William Lloyd Garrison personally, so I can't say what his personal motives were. Okay. I can't say to what extent he embodied this idea that he doesn't trust Black leadership. Was it for that reason? I have no idea. But he was very stiff and in some places condescending towards the people he was trying to help, the Black people he was trying to help. And those Black people were kind of like infighting with him around this idea of like, we should be in positions of leadership. And not necessarily that William Lloyd Garrison can't like co lead, but shouldn't there be some distinct and designated place where Black people clearly can shine as exemplified leaders? Okay, well, William Lloyd Garrison in this regard doesn't necessarily want to give up his position of power. And you can't, to some extent, you can say, yeah, perhaps racism is a part of the motive for something like that. But in reality, it could also just be the case that as an individual, he just wants power, right? And he wants to feel important. And in feeling important, because he's already in a position of control, he kind of just wants to keep it. Like I said, there's no way we can know for certain what his own motives were, but the reality was this is what he's faced with. Okay. And what's happening is it doesn't matter if it's the American Anti-Slavery Society that was led by William Lloyd Garrison or some other anti-slavery society. You have this weird phenomenon that's happening where it's like even among the abolitionists, for some reason, Black people are rarely holding positions of leadership. Stephanie says, Becoming Frederick Douglass on PBS is a great short program to watch that talks about this relationship with Garrison and how Garrison treated him. Yeah, actually, I only touched the surface on this, but absolutely, Becoming Frederick Douglass is actually a really great. It's not a series; it's a program, but yes, it's actually really insightful. Okay. But that's what's happening here. So now the anti-slavery movement has this interesting phenomenon in which they're infighting amongst themselves. Okay. Because ultimately they say they're united on the front of being against slavery, but then you have like race politics somehow kind of reverberating and echoing within their ranks that it becomes this thing is like, is this movement really dedicated or committed to the cause as much as it says it is? Right. Okay. So that's happening. And it complicates things. It muddies things. It's not as simple as we all agree we're on ending slavery because now there's a bunch of infighting. Elena says, "Oh no, it so often happens in different countries too." Yeah, and part of the reason is depending on the context, I think there is to some extent a human phenomenon of some people just want to feel important. Some people want to feel like they're empowered. Some people don't want to give up their power, even if it comes into conflict with what they say their core values are, right? Um, so it's just complicated in this regard, right? Now, having said that, you do have Black people that are participating in these anti-slavery societies, especially the white-led ones. But what's often happening is not only are you finding that there's like this echo of race politics where somehow white people are in positions of leadership and power and are the executive authorities, but now there's this sexism layer too. And the sexism layer that's there is that you have black and white women that could go to attendance in these meetings. They could be present, they can listen, they can kind of passively support, but they're not actually allowed to like participate in any of the proceedings that are going on here, especially when they have their own unique perspectives, their own views about things. And it's not just this passive, like, well, women belong in the back and just kind of stay silent. But you literally have some people that are going, no, you're a woman. There's no place of leadership for you here. You need to keep your mouth shut. And so it's like this, like, direct confrontational um, infighting of sexism that's kind of like jeopardizing their anti-slavery organizational proceeds or proceedings. Proceeds are like money, but proceedings. Okay. And then women keep pushing for more inclusion because women have a unique experience during slavery, in the context of slavery, in regards to their liberation, in how they navigate liberation that's fundamentally different from men. How can we be truly committed to an anti-slavery movement in any functional way if we're not going to acknowledge the unique experience that women have that needs to be centered in some significant regard? And at the same time that we're all united on this front of being against slavery, here we are infighting around sexism and gender roles and dynamics. And some people really are. Some people who are like, you might imagine, I would even go so far as to say, I wouldn't put it beyond William Lloyd Garrison himself, even though he's very proactive. Progressive on the slavery front, is also probably one of those people who's going, the women belong in the kitchen. They're making a sandwich and raising the kids. There's no room for you here. So you have to use your imagination to understand that even though these people might be leaning to some extent on political ideas that you might agree with, to some extent, you might also be disappointed by these people in the fact that they are compromised on other values too, right? Um, who is this? Elena says, "Oh my God, I saw a reel on black and white women trying to get voting rights, working side by side, and then white women got the rights and black women didn't, and white women kind of got on board with those who were anti-voting rights for black." Correct. Everybody, to some extent, for better or worse, and in its own respective context, everybody is kind of in it for themselves. Yeah. Everybody is in it for themselves, and so it just creates this phenomenon. If people can't get on the same page, how effective can they really be then at like challenging the expansion of this, especially when the United States is like acquiring all of these territories so goddamn fast, right? So you just kind of have to think about it in this way. It's like things are moving fast. The anti-slavery movement needs to get its shit together, but how can it get its shit together when they're compromised in several areas? So you have where finally, after a few years, I think it was 3 years. Yeah, the slide says 3 years, so I'm going to go with that. After about 3 years or so, you finally have where women have been pushing so hard to find some position of leadership within the AASS, that now that a woman is elected into a position of leadership and now men to some extent have to recognize that woman's power, you have people that are like, I'm out. There's no way that I'm going to sit here and I'm going to listen to this woman tell me what to do when I go home and I'm the head of my household, right? So it's a thing where it's like, it just sucks because it's like a lot of this infighting is needless, but a lot of the infighting is grounded in culture norms. And as these people are trying to challenge culture norms, they're also like falling victim to their own dysfunctional culture norms. How does that work? Right? Okay. So with the AASS essentially splitting here, you have black women and white women forming their own anti-slavery societies where they can give each other the power and the roles of leadership to put things in motion for themselves. Um, Tyrone says, so this was the beginning of the wariness among Black abolitionists about relying on white allies. Correct. Um, where to some extent, and I'm going to go on into detail on this in a few slides. Um, but it's like, how can you rely, even if you agree, where you all are in so much agreement that you can share space in the same room, you're still fighting with other people. And at the core of this issue, it is a Black centered issue where we're now finding ourselves fighting among white allies who are resisting. How can we even trust them? Because if you can't even trust them where they say they can be trusted, how down for the cause are they really? Brent says, a question you may be getting to, but the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo I've always wondered about, and when we annexed part of Mexico, is there a reason they didn't try to steal the whole country and just stole the southern states? Those might be two separate questions. Maybe I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. I think from a logistical perspective, like I said, the region of Texas is that region where you have a sizable majority of people who already existed there before they belonged to the United States that were fundamentally against the government of Mexico. But it's for that reason, right? So, logistically speaking and militaristically speaking, it's a little more expedient. And in the case of the US Mexico war, if Mexico can maintain its sovereignty, and ultimately, as you get down into the core region of what we know to be Mexico today, the further and further away from the United States it is, so it's harder to be able to militaristically annex those lands. However, if you're moving westward, where you've already converted a sizable majority of Mexicans in your favor, it really is easier to just expand westward where you're already in conflict. So hopefully that answers your question. Glenda says, I'm sorry if this is a stupid question, but what is the AASS and AFM? I'm sorry for the acronyms here. AASS is the American Anti-Slavery Society. They are helmed or were helmed by William Lloyd Garrison, a radical white abolitionist. Who was really down for racial equality, reparations, a Black integration into American society. Um, but Black people who are a part of the AASS are calling into question his leadership in what is ultimately a pro-Black issue. And that be, um, should it be led by Black people, both with and without experience, but just by virtue of them being Black, shouldn't they be at the helm? So that's where you get the infighting. AFAM AFAM is African American. I'm sorry if that was not clear. I'm not necessarily I don't like doing the thing where I read from my slides verbatim because I kind of already know what I'm talking about, but I'm sorry if that wasn't clear to you. AFAM is African American. Stephen Bowman, yes, to be clear, those territories were already stolen and taking the land would be more difficult. Correct. Okay. Um, so getting back to this point, you have you have because now a woman is in a position of leadership, you have people who are essentially throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Ah, man, you know what, man, what the fuck is this society for? We thought we were getting somewhere, but I'm not going to yield to the power of this woman while we're doing blah blah blah. So they're falling prey to their own sexism. Okay. And as they're falling prey to their own sexism here, um, essentially the AAS splits. And in splitting, you have Black people, Black male, white, Black females, excuse me, white females, who would essentially try to like form their own offshoots. Well, I'm going to make my own anti-slavery society with blackjack and hookers. That's a Futurama reference. No one was saying blackjack and hookers. But the point is, I'm going to make my own thing and I'm going to make it better. And my society is going to do what I want it to do. So now you have people that are like dividing. And what's interesting is that everybody is essentially dividing in a way. They have their own abolitionist society, but what ends up happening is where you do have integrated societies too, you have an interesting thing that's happening where white women are forming their own abolitionist society. Black people are forming their own abolitionist society, but then Black women are forming their own abolitionist society separate from Black men because of the sexism politics in there. So, like, the infighting is creating division, which then creates subdivisions where now, like, these people are segregating, and they're segregating along the lines that they are also simultaneously arguing that they should be united on. Isn't that interesting? Okay. So African Americans then, of course, are going to be joining black majority or all black societies, because then that's where you're going to get black leadership. You're going to be a more consolidated organization. They're going to do what they want. But then the reality is, on the outside, I'm not saying this is valid. I'm not saying this is the way things should be. But if an all black organization is run, who is going to take them seriously? And that's something they have to face too, is that fundamentally and functionally, it does make sense that black people should be at the helm, but black people are also not being taken seriously. The same could be said for women too. Who's going to take an all women's abolitionist society seriously, even if the reason why they're united makes sense and has merit? Okay. So the issue that you're faced with here is most of the funding that is available is going to, like, white led auxiliaries. And where you do have black male led auxiliaries, they're still the recipients of fundraising. But now you have this issue where women's auxiliaries are not getting funding. Certainly, black women's auxiliaries are not getting funding. And so it's interesting that as these people are positioning themselves in such a way that they are trying to challenge culture norms, they themselves are not only perpetuating them, but falling prey to them too. Okay. Elena says, why the people who were white allies at the time couldn't understand that there should be no systemic racism in these organizations, even in details like who's going to be the voice of the movement, or is it about a fight for privilege? I mean, ultimately, I will say to you, I wasn't there. So I can't really tell you. The reality is that it's going to be complicated, right? But despite the fact that it is complicated, the reality is that you still have people who are operating with social norms. Yeah, Stephen says social norms were likely a heavy contributor, right? Social norms. And then you have the issue of, like, regardless of race, regardless of gender, people like having power, and having power that other people don't have, that other people have to yield to and recognize. And so then you have people that are in competition for that power and want to challenge that power. And if they can't get the power in the place that they go to, then they're going to create a circumstance where they can have the power themselves. And so it creates this really complicated issue where they're not necessarily united in the ways that they would like to be. They say they would like to be, but when it really comes down to being about what they're saying, it's falling apart, right? So, um, where you do have women's auxiliaries that then go on to kind of form, you know, a feminist suffrage movement to some extent, and it ultimately is successful, not for several decades after this, but ultimately was successful. You still have this phenomenon in which I think that the easiest way that I could articulate this to you is it's one thing to champion ideals, but it's another thing entirely to truly be about them, right? And so this is the first circumstance in American history, US history rather, but US history in which this is being revealed, right? Is it's one thing to say that you are about Black liberation and empowerment and equality, but then when that requires you to willfully give up your power to do so, uh, are you really about what you have been going to jail and screaming from the rooftops about? And so this is where you then get into this issue where for Black people, they are then questioning whether they can even rely on their white allies. Because when it comes to words, their white allies can say all of the things that they agree with and want to hear all day long. But when it comes to action, suddenly they falter. And we see this not only play out during this period in time, but also during the period in time of the civil rights movement, right? And not just the civil rights movement. Yeah, Stephen says, like Congress too. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, yeah, you want to elect representatives, right? And that goes for both sides. I would say that's Republicans and Democrats alike. It's not really it's a political issue. It's not a partisan one. Is you elect a representative who says all of the sweet things that they tell you that they're going to do, and they make these promises and they really sound like they're about what they say. And then they get into office and then they start making decisions that clearly demonstrate that, at least politically speaking, they're kind of compromised, right? Um, so to some extent, you have to recognize this is a human phenomenon. It's a political phenomenon, but it's one that transcends political context. It's not uniquely racial. It's not uniquely gender specific. Um, it's just a circumstantial phenomenon in which you will observe it. And I think on the back end, right, we're the people of the future, who can then look at this complicated situation in retrospect and realize that a complicated aspect of political reality, even when you agree with people, you share the same aspirations, you will still find that you conflict with the people you agree with in certain areas that then test the merit of your political aspirations. Lena says, but it all magically played into a disaster in tax systems, looks like. I kind of understand what you mean. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay. Um, Moving forward now, right? Don't forget about Christianity. Okay. Don't forget about the, the importance and the significance of religion in the context of all of this playing out here. Is you have first of all, churches are segregated. They're frankly, with regard to or exception to non-denominational churches and barbershops, remain the most segregated places in American society. So within the Black church, they're always preaching a message around abolitionism. And essentially, God, I hate using this term because it carries a pejorative context. However, it is true. To some extent, the leaders of the Black church are cherry picking the verses of the Bible that conveniently support their message around Black liberation and freedom. Okay. Now, having said that, when I say cherry picking comes with this connotation of like intellectual dishonesty, which is not necessarily the case. It's not like these people are trying to like spread misinformation and mislead. However, we're all hopefully we're all adults here, regardless of your religious views. We're all of the understanding that everyone can find the message in the Bible that perfectly fits how they feel and ignore a message that contradicts it. Okay. Now, having said that, within the Black church, the church is a place that is kind of like a bastion for political meetings and religious meetings alike. And to some extent, the lines are blurred. Sometimes people are going to church for a spiritual message, but that spiritual message is also intertwined with political rhetoric too. Okay. And then at the same time, when the church is not being used for service, like Sunday service or Sabbath service, because Seventh Day Adventists can worship on Saturdays. In general, then the church is kind of vacant, so it can be used as a place for like other abolitionist groups to meet when service is not in session. Okay. So the clergy are essentially at all times, I would say that the church is like the locus, the location where the clergy is using their pulpit to attack slavery. and attack slavery in a divinely ordained and righteous way. That, like, as we've already said, slavery is a moral atrocity, and in the eyes of God, you should feel guilty. It's called into question whether you're going to go to heaven for doing this to other human beings, and blah blah blah. On and on it goes. They're attacking slavery. They're attacking racism. They're even going so far as to criticize these pro-white churches because as these churches are racially segregated, these or excuse me, not pro-white churches, but white churches are pro-slavery. Okay. And in being pro slavery, a lot of their biblical rhetoric is around how God has ordained them to own human beings as property and that they need to abide by the word of God and protect that institution at all costs. Okay. And in some cases, it depends on the church. It depends on the leader. The ACS here is the American Colonization Society. If you recall, I think it was either last week or 2 weeks ago, where we were talking about this idea that there was the society that put together this idea of sending formerly enslaved Black people back to Africa to colonize a region of Africa that would ultimately become Liberia. And certain Black people were in support, other Black people were not. Depending on the church that they then went to, you could have Black people who are like criticizing the ACS. How dare they do us this way? They've acculturated us to American society. We don't know how to survive in Africa. And then they go and send us back to Africa and we're on our own and we can't do anything when we're entitled. We're human beings and we deserve freedom and justice here where we exist. Right. So the church is like a place that it's complicated, right? We talked about the rise of evangelism. You have white evangelicals, you have Black evangelicals, you have white people who are pro-slavery, but in the church. You have Black people who are anti-slavery, but in the church. Everybody is justifying their rhetoric. Everybody centers their political rhetoric within the religious house. And over time, throughout the conglomerate of this, like, I don't know, the best way I can describe it is, you know how the cords in the back of your TV or your entertainment system are all coiled up and tossed together. In the conglomerate mix of this all, what you end up with is an American society whose politics are fundamentally intertwined with religiosity. Religiosity, to some extent, is inseparable from politics. And then in the mix of that, then it is inseparable from race politics, right? Sound familiar? And so even if you're not a Christian, right? You don't necessarily need to be a Christian, but to some extent, if you're familiar with American society enough, you know that every element of what I'm describing here kind of just accurately describes the cultural context of the United States of America. Okay. Um, I'm going to do one more slide here, and then we'll split this lecture in two because I want to give time for Q&A and uh, yeah, we'll do this for the sake of time. But last slide here, right? So Black churches are usually those places where if they're not like being used for a sermon or a service of some kind, that then as long as the organization that wants to use the space is anti-slavery, then they can be anti-slavery. And they can use it as an organizational space and to meet. So Black churches tend to be those places where political activism kind of has its grassroots efforts, where you get abolitionist speakers like William Lloyd Garrison, like Frederick Douglass. You get even sometimes these all-white anti-slavery organizations that are not allowed to use white churches because they're anti-slavery. So they're allowed to be all white and to organize in the Black church, right? So the Black church becomes that place that centers all of these anti-slavery initiatives in this regard. Okay. And like I said, the complex mix of this all is we could talk about these things in relation to slavery, in relation to the Civil War, in relation to politics, in relation to religion. But if you just step outside the box conceptually, like use your imagination to step outside the box, what you can see that is being normalized, that is contributing to the American society that we all know today, is religiosity, race, political partisanship, um, and all of the let's say the complicated iterations or permutations therein are creating a complex whole in which American identity is kind of fundamentally inseparable from all of these different and distinct aspects. It kind of just becomes like intertwined in the whole thing, if that makes sense, right? Um, and so we'll leave it there. We'll go a little bit into more detail about Frederick Douglass's relationship to William Lloyd Garrison. We'll talk about all of that next week when we continue this lecture. But for now, I'll leave it there. We're on slide 16. I'd like to open it up for Q&A at this time. If you have any questions, if you want, if you you have any questions, you got comments, you got curiosities, anything like that, feel free to chime in.
So I might have asked this in a previous lecture.
Okay.
So it's good that we're talking about the church and so I was always told, or at least told by some of my black friends that who are more up on African American studies than I, that the church was kind of a sanctuary from like getting beat. I know that there was resistance from like even letting slaves have churches, but like once they were there, I think I was told that it was like actually a sanctuary for from being beaten
Mhm.
or raped, at least while you were there. You know what I mean?
Yes.
You had to leave church sometime,
Yeah.
but while you were there, they wouldn't attack you in that way.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Yes. And the reason is because even on the pro-slavery side for white people, there is a reverence to spirituality and religion, right? That even though there's the white supremacy politics, the slaveholding politics, and all of that, that to some extent, if these people are worshiping the Lord, they're channeling the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, if you will, whatever language you use, um, that's probably an inappropriate place to introduce the politics of discipline and violence. And so, in that regard, it was respected. And so, Black people then found sanctuary in the church and would often become deeply spiritual in order to kind of maintain connection to that sense of liberation in that way. Yes, that is true. Um, Tyrone, do contemporary libertarian-oriented economics programs in Southern universities reflect ideological continuities with antebellum Southern economic thought that defended slavery and racial hierarchy? That is a very complicated question. First of all, that is loaded, but not because I want to dismiss your question. So allow me to explain what I mean when I say that's loaded. The reason why it's loaded is libertarianism, to my understanding, I'm gonna acknowledge my bias before I continue. To my understanding, libertarianism doesn't really find solid footing in being entirely conservative or entirely progressive, but it also kind of lacks a substantive political identity too, even though we have this name libertarian. But Stephen wants to chime in. Yeah. Are you raising your hand? I'm sorry. Oh, no. Okay. Um, so in that regard, to my understanding and to my exposure, when I've come across a libertarian, they usually have different views than someone else who identifies as libertarian. And so the political ideology of libertarianism to me is so inconsistent that now when we're talking about Southern politics, universities, ideological continuities, blah, 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 it just becomes for me to be able to answer your question so muddled that I don't think I could give an answer. Right.
Okay.
Um,
I would ask, I was asking that because I am at a Southern university that is again in the backdrop of the antebellum South.
Mhm.
So, in the context of when you were talking about it earlier, you said, "Oh, how dare the government? How dare the government overreach into my views on slavery or what's generating money for me?" Because in the South, it was at that time completely agricultural, so everything depended on agriculture, and that was the bread basket for the South.
Yep.
But long story short, when you see like my experience in a southern libertarian leaning economics department, it has that same sentiment. It has the same sentiment of how dare the government interfere.
Yeah.
That's the basis of it. It's
Yeah.
it's this idea of government interference. It, and
Yeah.
I don't
That.
want to and I don't want to bastardize like libertarian economics. I'm not a libertarian at all, obviously. But yet and still, like, to have that continuation at a southern university, and I'm
Mhm.
gonna not gonna say which university, but that had doesn't have the best record with racial solidarity and has a long and mired history of being on the wrong side of history.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um,
No,
you
continue.
I would question, I question it every day,
Yeah.
just a little
Yeah.
bit.
Yeah. Sure. I think that the best thing I can say is it sounds like the views of this university or its politics and its history is not necessarily unique to libertarianism, but rather the history of the South and the history of the South in relation to, the history of white supremacy, the history of conservative politics, which I think libertarianism significantly overlaps, but is also distinguished to some regard. But where it distinguishes itself from conservatism, it's really difficult to pinpoint what truly is libertarian because from person to person, institution to institution, it varies so widely that it really is hard to say that something is truly libertarian and not just a derivative of conservatism. It's kind of hard. So I just can't answer your question. I'm very sorry about that.
Oh no, that's
Um,
fine. Thank you.
yeah. Um, yeah, Jake says, going to Brent's question about the Treaty of Hidalgo, I wonder if the expansion too far south may have threatened the political power and drive of Northern abolitionists. Black churches played a huge role in the Underground Railroad, which also expanded west in helping slaves escape slavery to states out west that were free states, including their roles in the protesting of laws forbidding Black immigrants from entering the state of California and testifying in court. Yeah, sure. Do you feel that there could have been any impact of the physical border division of free and slave states when the U.S. took over the territories of Mexico, and that may have halted an expansion too far south into modern day Mexico? Okay, Jake. I need you if you can. I'm assuming you have a microphone. There's two versions of you in the chat here. Is there any way you might be able to chime in and simplify your question a little bit? It's not to be dismissive, it's just a little convoluted. Would you mind helping me out? What do you mean?
Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, I know that seemed a little confusing. No, I was wondering if the whole Mason-Dixon line, if we enter too far into Mexico, I wonder if that might have given fear to northern states and abolitionists that there'd be too much territory, too much power,
Mm,
too much income. That's kind of what I was wondering because we weren't exactly expanding into our neighbors in Canada and taking them over.
yeah.
Um,
Part of the reason why we weren't expanding into Canada is because they're white. Part of the reason why we felt entitled to take over the parts of Mexico, especially Mexico as it is independent from Spain, is because many of these Mexicans are brown. They are indigenous. They are the descendants of those that are indigenous. And so, therefore, we perceive them, we being white Americans, perceive them to be racially inferior. And so are therefore willing to challenge their sovereignty in a way that we are unwilling to then challenge the sovereignty of a neighbor country like Canada. In terms of expanding southward, again, logistically speaking, you have to think about, especially during the 1800s. uh, geographically where the United States is currently situated, and that expanding westward, tactically speaking, where you've already converted a sizable majority in your favor, is going to be much easier to expand westward than going down. The further down you go, let's erase the North. I don't think the North is really relevant here because you have to remember the politics of Southern slaveholders is they didn't give a shit about the people in the North. In fact, they didn't care about them because their political values were antithetical to theirs. So, to some extent, you might say it would be in the interest to expand southward. Except the reason why you're not expanding southward, but you're expanding westward, is because there's a finite, definitive end. You can get to an end where you can then say, from sea to shining sea, although they're not intentionally going after this verbiage, from sea to shining sea, this is ours. And then maybe we might consider at some point in the future going beyond it, but we're going to lay claim to what we know God has ordained for us, and that is from coast to coast. And so, logistically speaking, it's just easier to expand westward, especially if Mexico is already willing to cede a certain region of land and go, hey, we'll give you this. Don't mess with us. Here's our border from here on out. Okay. And that's where you get a fall in westward. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yes, very much. Thank you.
Yeah. Tommy says, I find libertarians as on the fence type of people. They're chameleons. Yes, that's what I mean when I say like on the fence, chameleon-ish is it's libertarianism to some extent has a name and it's kind of trendy to some extent for certain people to identify as libertarian. However, when it comes to honing in on what like unites these political values, I find that one person who identifies as libertarian has a completely different set of political values that contradicts someone else who identifies as libertarian. But with what they do agree on, they usually agree with conservatives and Republicans. So for me, it's just a trendy, hip and trendy way to not be a conservative, but still be a conservative. That's how I see it, though, and I want to recognize that is my own personal perspective, but it seems like you agree with me. So maybe I'm not too far off, right? Um, as Stephen says, as I understand it, which isn't very well, libertarians and kind of like Republicans that like to smoke weed, sure. I think they oppose any government infringement. Right, they agree with conservatives on that regard, but they don't seem to have a problem with enjoying the benefits of government institutions, which yeah, to some extent. But then that those are like mutually exclusive, right? You can't really have both. It's either one or the other. So it's just a weird, like I don't know. Libertarianism for me is not really a thing. It's just a way to try to be unique where you're really not.
Politics
Michael,
101 to chime in for a second is
yeah,
kind
sure,
of
sure,
people want opposing things. They want better services and lower taxes.
yeah,
That's where I find libertarianism most of the
okay,
time.
yeah, sure.
Because it's funny as you were speaking there was a bit of a conversation going on with that on in the chat, and you kind of nailed it on that.
Yeah. I and so having said that, I have never seen a libertarian politician. I've never seen someone officially politically embody the politics of libertarianism. It's always just a random person who calls themselves libertarian. And it again, in aggregate, you find that like what the hell is this even? I don't know. Um Yeah, right. Okay. So, having said that, I mean, the rest of this is a kind of offshoot conversation. But is there anyone who has any other questions? Questions to add? Also, friendly reminder for those of you in the IG Live chat. You're welcome to chime in. If you don't want to chime in on the Zoom session, you can type your question out. I'm kind of keeping a passive eye on the chat window over there. But does anyone have any additional questions about this? Yes, no. Okay. Well, oh wait, here we go. I actually have a question about your reel. Yeah, go for it. You can chime in here if you have a mic. Hmm, need a swig of water.
Do you hear me well?
Yes, I do.
All right. So my question was about your reel that talked about the racism and how it's never gonna end, basically.
Mhm.
So is there a way you could elaborate on that a little bit, if it's okay? Like, what does it necessarily mean that, like, I don't know,
Yeah,
like
yeah, sure.
we're all racist,
Yes,
yes,
yes.
but like, but the system. So does it mean that the system in the United States is never going to change? Yeah. So what do you
Yeah,
mean?
okay. So, first of all, lots of people mean lots of different things when they talk about racism. Some people mean a system of power. Other people mean bigotry and prejudice. Some people mean, and so then it becomes a thing where it's like really muddled. In general, the layperson definition of racism is some form of bigotry and prejudice or discrimination against people on the basis of their racial identity. Okay. And on the layperson level of understanding, that makes sense because in history, duh, that's what you see. You see bigotry, you see prejudice, you see the KKK, you see resistance to the civil rights movement, you see all of these different things. So racism must be that. And it is, but it's actually a little bit more broad than that. Because the reality is, if we were to go along the definition of racism is just bigotry and prejudice and discrimination, then I put on you, what is the solution? What is the solution to it?
Oh, should I answer?
Sure, go for it. Try.
Okay, if it's bigotry and discrimination, then we need to introduce a system that's gonna sort it out, like laws against it, which happened and it didn't work. Um,
Per,
right?
per,
Or no? I don't know.
perhaps. However, for most people, the answer is going to be just stop being a bigot, stop discriminating, end prejudice. But the reality is, prejudice is a subjective experience. It's something that is perpetuated subjectively. I always use this example in my classes because it's an example that's true for me. I hate, capital HATE, hate grapefruit. I hate it with a passion. I think it's absolutely disgusting. I can't imagine for the life of me why anyone could find a grapefruit delicious. Grapefruit juice, let alone. All right, great. Now end my prejudice. Can you do it?
Do you hate people that like grapefruit? Because I do like it.
I'm getting to the people aspect, but right now I'm talking about my preference for grapefruit. End it. How can you actually end my subjective dislike for something that someone else might go, "Hey, grapefruit is delicious."
But
You
it
can't.
depends, like, but like, do you want it to not exist? Like,
No, I mean, I'm not going that far. I'm just saying I don't ever really want to have anything to do with grapefruit at all. Grapefruit can kick rocks as far as I'm concerned. I don't need a bottle of grapefruit juice. I don't need any of the fruit in my household. There's plenty of other options out there that I'm perfectly fine in terms of citrus, but grapefruit is absolutely not one of them. And so now here I am describing to you that I have a prejudice, and my
mm-hmm.
prejudice is against this specific type of fruit. End it. You'll never be able
Well,
to end my prejudice because it's subjective to me, right? I think pickles are delicious. I love pickles on my sandwiches. I love them on my burgers, but somebody else might go, I absolutely hate pickles. One of the things that me and my wife would constantly kind of have a conflict over is onions. She hates onions. I think she has this genetic thing that makes onions like disgusting to her, and I love them. And so,
mm-hmm.
how do you find the middle ground there? My point is that the phenomenon of prejudice is so subjective that, like in reality, there's no ability for us to exercise any form of control over something like that. Okay, so maybe if we have no ability to influence what prejudices people have, then to some extent it might be unrealistic to say that we can end prejudice. Okay. The same goes for power differentials. Some people say racism is a system of power. Okay. Well, will we ever live in a society where everyone has the same economic power, the same social power, the same political power? No. What could we possibly do to intentionally manipulate the circumstance so that everyone has equal power in society? It's not going to happen. So maybe our understanding of racism is a little reductive. Well, where does that leave us? Well, what is racism really? Well, I can point to you several examples of racism that do not encompass bigotry or prejudice. We might look at, um, eh, sorry, Brent turned on the microphone. Did you want to chime in or? Oh, okay. Okay, so there are several examples of non-bigoted racism. You've got Asian American History Month, Latin American History Month. We've got BET. We have a division of in the U.S. Department of Labor and Affairs for the Indian American Division. There are ways in which, like, I don't know, on campus at LMU, we have the LMU African American Alumni Association Scholarship, right? These are all examples of like acknowledging race, putting emphasis on race, being racially selective, but not necessarily in ways that perpetuate discrimination and bigotry. And if we
But
can
wait,
recognize,
sorry. Yeah, just like isn't it like not nationalism, but this is isn't it like something nationalistic? Isn't that the name for it? Like when you're proud of your, culture sort of thing? It's not racist
well,
or
yeah, but see, let go of your notion that racism is just bigotry and prejudice and hate.
sure.
Because what I'm saying is we're in the language of Black entertainment television, in the language of African American History Month, in the language of all of the ways that we can recognize race and reinforce racial politics. We can do that without actually perpetuating bigotry and prejudice. And they're still racist because they still follow along the racial norms that we recognize in society, the racial categories that we see and recognize and distinguish in society: Black, white, Asian, Latino, etc. So to some extent, what I'm describing here around the African American Alumni Association Scholarship kind of is racist. It's just not wrong. Okay. So
hmm
if we were to recognize then that racism can be bigotry, but is actually a little bit more complicated than that, then maybe racism really is just the ability to see and distinguish people based on a generally agreed upon understanding of race. And from that, we can
hmm
produce forms of oppression, racialized disadvantage, but actually we might be able to identify or imagine what are the solutions to those problems too. And so right now, everyone in society is calibrated to racism is just it's wrong. So now we have a Supreme Court that has just ruled that affirmative action is unconstitutional and that colleges and universities cannot factor in race when making their admissions decisions about college applicants or things like that. And the reality is that we're continuing to produce racialized disadvantage and we think the solution is to just ignore race, not realizing that just because you can ignore it doesn't mean that you suddenly fix the problem. In actuality, the solution to the problem of racial inequality is actually to be more race conscious, not less, to lean into your understanding of racism a little bit and to leverage it in ways that are ethically responsible, not ethically irresponsible. So
hmm
my argument is racism is it's not actually just bigotry and prejudice. It can be, but all of the solutions to the racial problems that exist in society will only ever be remedied when we're all willing to admit that racism is a little bit more complicated. And actually, we can leverage our racial awareness to start intentionally resolving many of the problems that exist here. That does mean developing policy that is race conscious and seeks to target historically marginalized groups and to give them selective advantages that, in the context of history, they have not had. And the goal is to work towards a kind of statistical convergence. If we are intentionally working towards cultivating equality in American society, then to some extent, we really do have to be racially selective in certain ways in order to bring these patterns of disparity to a place of statistical convergence. And when we get, let's say, housing, wealth inequality, life expectancy at birth, school funding, college admission rates, when we start to see that statistically racialized differences are beginning to converge, whatever policies we have been developing to level the playing field, to cultivate real equality in American society, we can now keep it there. But the only way we're ever going to get there is when we start being racially selective. We actually start employing racialized policies and metrics, but we're doing so with ethical and moral consciousness, not bigotry and prejudice. This would then mean then that racism is not just bigotry and prejudice. It's actually a little bit more than that. We're never going to get rid of racism so long as even the people in this screen, you've got white people, you've got different shades of black in here. We've got a Native American guy here, right? All of our visible differences are plain as day, right? And so because those things are visible, the racism, as minute as it is never going to really go away. We can all see and distinguish who's different, who's like us, who's not. So instead of
Mm-hmm.
entertaining this idea that we can end racism, that's never really going to happen. It actually is just about how we're using our racism. Are we using it to perpetuate harm and disadvantage? Or are we actually leveraging our racism to cultivate a truly fair, just, and equal society? And I would contend that if you are on the ethical, equality oriented end of the spectrum, then leveraging racism to contribute to that outcome is a necessary good. I'm not talking about violence. I'm not talking
Mm-hmm.
about prejudice. I'm not talking about bigotry. I'm talking about intentionally cultivating equality. And intentionally cultivating those things means being able to say, I see that over 50% of people who are experiencing homelessness in the state of California are African American, and I am going to develop policy that explicitly targets these groups of people and helps them to raise them up to a place of potential equal standing where they can have stability in their lives and we can resolve this issue. And once we level the playing field, we don't need to rely on racism anymore. We just need to develop sound policy that helps them to stay there. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So it just
Thank
becomes
you
a
so
thing where
much. Yeah.
you're using racism as a tool, not just looking at it as bigotry and prejudice. And then here's Donald Trump enacting all of this bigotry and prejudice, and everyone is going, well, I'm not racist. Guess he wins. And then here we are in an America no one wants to live in because no one's willing to get their elbows as dirty as he is.
Yeah, like I feel like they're using whatever this definition of racism that you showed right now, they're actually pretty smart and saying, oh, people don't want racism. They're not
Mhm.
gonna get racism. And so they're working with the other side of it, then looks like
Yeah,
with the good side. Thank you so much for taking this time
yeah,
to
sure.
answer the question.
Sure.
Thank you. I
I will
appreciate
tell
it.
you that where this idea came for me was when I was in graduate school. I really did just have the desire to go, okay, I'm learning scientific thinking and reasoning, and I want to figure out a way to scientifically model how racism functions in society and to identify and exploit its weak points. And if I can identify and exploit its weak points, then I can potentially come up with a solution to this very complicated problem. And I will tell you that I am fairly confident that the idea is that racism is not really something that can be ended so long as our differences are as visible as day. It really just becomes about how we're using it. And how we're
Mm-hmm.
using it, there are lots of examples in society of ways in which racism is being used for good. for
Mm-hmm.
ethical productivity, for constructing a more fair, just, and equal society, and do not embody bigotry and prejudice. Okay. So my argument is that racism is not just bigotry and prejudice. My argument is more like racism is just racism. And it's just about how we're using it. And right now, we live in a society that thinks racism is just this negative and can't imagine any of the solutions to these problems at all. Tyrone.
Well, this is actually Tyrone's wife. Um,
Oh, hey,
so
yeah, sure.
I don't know. I feel like I get what you're trying to say and I get what you're trying to go towards, but I just feel like it's over intellectualizing like the argument
Okay.
and saying that, racial like having equity through a racial lens. I don't agree that that is in itself racism. The racism is locking people out systematically.
Mhm.
And so just because we put a scholarship out for, black students or Asian students, though that to me it's equity through a racial lens. It's righting racial wrongs.
Mhm.
It is undoing the racial harm. And just because there's a racial lens, it's not systematic. So I just disagree with the framing of it as racism. I just think that's over intellectualizing it
Okay.
for maybe a non-minority audience to kind of bring them along through like the argument. No, black people, Asian people, people of color, gay people, there was harm done to them systematically, and those wrongs need to be righted. And
Sure.
just because it's hard for white people to hear that, I don't agree that we should shift our Overton window to call it and frame it as racism.
Okay.
I,
Can I
I
ask a
just
follow-up
disagree.
question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. My follow-up question is you use the word systematic. So, in order for us to establish a common definition, would you mind putting forward just a layperson, don't over intellectualize it, but explain to me your understanding of systemic racism?
Systemic racism is about like the locking out of institutions. So, as far as school, housing, basic needs, like education, all of those things, the basic needs for a person to move up socioeconomically.
Mhm.
And
Okay.
those are tools to do that. And
Okay.
minorities were locked out of those systems. So to me, it's just righting the wrongs of locking us out of those systems, the right to work and things like that.
Yes. So now I ask you, your imagination to think about what systemic anti-racism is. What is systemic anti-racism going to look like as a natural opposite to what you just described of systemic racism?
Can you give me your definition of systemic anti-racism? I guess
Mhm.
that word kind of
Yeah. So anti-racism, I would argue, uses the same blueprints, the same idea of race, black, white, Asian, Hispanic, Latino, etc. But rather than producing inequality and disadvantage, is intentionally working towards equality and keeping society calibrated towards equality. And in relation to history, it means identifying patterns of marginalization and then intentionally developing methods of intervention that specifically target those groups of people, not necessarily to exclude them, but rather to intentionally include them. It means then that you're working towards a truly fair, intentionally just and equal society, but in a racially selective way. So for me, that's still racism. It's still making strategic racial selections, but rather than producing harm and disadvantage, we are using racial selectiveness, call it anti racist discrimination, but for the purpose of cultivating truly fair, just, and equal outcomes. And so that is still racist selection, but it's racist because we are being racially selective and racially conscious, not bigoted and prejudiced. Do you see the distinction?
I see the distinction that you're making, but I still disagree with framing it as racism. Like, it's not necessarily a move to get towards equality, it's a move to get towards equity. I don't think writing systemic harms through like, internally in that system, because the balance of power still isn't there. So I think that, to me, that's what's missing out of that equation, is the power of those groups to elevate and push forward systemically, broadly systemically. And why I would argue that is because, well, institutionally, let's say you get a scholarship because you are an African American student or of some selective group, some minority group, or even just like being a woman or something. But systemically, your chances of even being admitted into that college is still less, because you are still impacted by that system. You are still almost locked out in a way, and this is just a way to sustain yourself within that institution of racism still. So I don't think that I'm necessarily saying that the bigotry of it all is, like, the correction, because I don't have to, like, a white person in my class doesn't have to like me for me to belong in that classroom. Like, so, the institution of it, like an admissions person, giving a Black person scholarship, like, I don't have to, like, be personable with these people or anything to have a right to be within that system. So I would argue that we're not pushing away from, the definition of it just being bigotry and vitriol and hate for minority groups. I really agree with you on that part. But to me, the institutional power, we don't have that, because, statistically, the numbers are not on our side to argue that we do have institutional power to right the wrongs ourselves. Because if that was the case, my Black ass, I would have 40 acres and a mule
Yeah, sure.
already.
So what I want to call attention to here is the original question that was being asked was around the theoretical framework that I'm showing behind me here. I've been teaching on this for a while, for which up here, I have repositioned the term racism, where most people consider bigotry and prejudice to be racism. I have repositioned it, and I make the argument that racism is just the ability to categorize and distinguish people based on a generally agreed upon understanding of race. And this is the theoretical framework that I use to do it, in which I say, if we start up here, where we see that racism really is, if we put it on a moral spectrum, you have unethical forms of racism, you have ethical forms of racism. Racism is actually just kind of neutral, right? You just said a key phrase, my Black ass. Okay. Now, in that, you're talking about yourself. You acknowledge your race. You put emphasis on it to some extent, right? And in putting emphasis on it, what you're actually circling around is a kind of benign form of racism. You're acknowledging your race. You're acknowledging the significance of it to some degree. Okay. Um, in acknowledging the significance of your race, you're not producing patterns of harm, nor are you necessarily producing good. It's actually just a kind of benign racism, right? We have other faces in the chat here. Let's say Stephen Bowman here, a Native American individual, that making the argument here, not saying you are, but making the argument that he could pass for white. Okay. And in passing for white, my ability to just simply recognize that if I saw Stephen Bowman randomly on the street, I would probably not think twice about whether the fact or not this guy is a white guy. Okay. How am I producing harm? How am I producing good? I'm not. It's actually just kind of benign. So I can see race. I can distinguish differences between myself. You're a Black person. I'm a Black person. I know who belongs to my group or might belong to my group, and I can clearly see who might not. Okay. But When I start engaging in forms of bigotry and hate and prejudice is when I start to manifest the unethical forms, what I call traditional racism. Some people liken it to malignant racism. And in those malignant forms, we are producing racial inequality. Okay. And our society is calibrated to this end, right? We see racial inequality in housing, home ownership rates, wealth, outcomes, job acquisition, or the distribution of occupations, right? We see it in life expectancy or birth outcomes, incarceration rates, college admission rates. All aspects of our society are currently calibrated in this area, right? And the mechanisms that produce those outcomes are from individual forms of bigotry and prejudice, but also institutional forms and systemic forms too, the ways in which institutions kind of collectively work together to produce these outcomes of racial inequality. So all I'm saying is I have the interest in figuring out how to identify the weak points of our society here and exploit those weak points with the idea of figuring out a theoretical fix. Okay. And the reality is that in the same way that racial selection produces these differential outcomes, racial selection is actually equally or can be equally responsible for reducing those outcomes. Rather than producing racial inequality, we are intentionally reducing racial inequality. That means a reduction in the disparities with relation to housing or home ownership, a reduction in the disparities in terms of wealth, a reduction in the disparities, I'll get to you, a reduction in the disparities to health outcomes, all of the same disparities that I'm saying here, but now we're talking about a kind of anti-racism, which in essence, because it's still racially conscious, is racially aware, is technically still a kind of racism, but it's not bigotry and prejudice, right? You have individuals who embody anti-racist beliefs and philosophies and ideals, right? And then in addition to that, no one is talking about what institutional anti-racism looks like or systemic anti-racism and the ways in which racial selection can be exploited to reduce patterns of inequality. I want to get to Stephen because he raised his hand first, and then Tyrone or Tyrone's wife. Yeah.
So you would not be alone in assuming at first glance that I'm white. Everybody generally does until you see me standing next to my mother or my grandparents, and then they're like, "So, oh, I see it." But yeah, it's I agree with you on the benign racism. So it's I use it in my own life. I'm not gonna lie. So an example is I am not a religious person. I do not care for religions, any of them in general. But I have many black friends. And so the topic of religion, I am more forgiving with my black friends because I understand how the church became one was a sanctuary and two it became an impetus for power and it still is, right? The same is true when I was in college and you have to write reviews for your professors as a student. I studied sexism, so I'm more likely to give high marks to women because I know that the system is already stacked against them. I also understand that sadly, affirmative action greatly benefits white women, and not that's there's a lot of research that shows that, unfortunately. So I mean, like it can be used as a tool for good. I mean, I don't know. You can be your own judge as to whether what I did was good, but I kind of feel that like it does help me shut myself up and try to understand the struggle that people are going through. That's kind of all I wanted to say.
Yeah, sure.
And like I
Sure. Sure. Thank you. Yeah, and then Tyrone or Tyrone's wife. I don't really know how to distinguish until you start speaking, but
All right. I just kind of overheard the discussion, so it is me. I mean, for me, the reason why I'm having such a hard time is, and I see it in the chat, is I think with this kind of framing of it as racism, I think we're leading people down kind of like a slippery slope to say the least. I would just call it a slippery slope because minority communities, by the definition of us being in minority, we do not have the institutional power to change that outcome. So you're speaking about like shifting disparities. I think we can impact disparity, but we are not statistically changing the numbers. Like those racial outcomes have been cemented over hundreds of years as the USA as an institution. We can shift some of the impact of the disparities, we can impact our direct community and things like that. But until, like, when we're talking about what institutional anti-racism would look like, I mean, even us having a black president, maybe if he had, or biracial president, maybe if he had more of the will to enforce things politically, to kind of reframe things and or kind of enforce his own political power and the political momentum that he has. I think the closest thing that we have to your definition of um, ethical anti-racism in the institution might be Zoran Mamdani, but even then, I'd argue against it because it's more of like a universal policy. So it's not just that minority communities are impacted. So I think for me, your definition, for me at least, in my opinion, kind of sets the stage that we would already have to be equal for such a thing to exist.
Yeah, sure.
So,
It leaves us with the question of I can certainly agree with you in saying that, like, realistically trying to manifest these outcomes is an uphill battle, damn near impossible. But then it raises the question of, well, do we even try? And if at the end of the day, I don't think you're making the argument that we shouldn't try, right? Um, and so if we're left with the question of, well, if we're going to try, what is the most effective solution going to look like? And for me, me personally, I'm not necessarily trying to say you have to agree with me. So please don't take anything that I'm saying this way. I'm saying me personally because I've been in academia basically my entire life. I have an interest in using and leveraging scientific knowledge to just figure out what the weak point is. What's the weakness? What's the chink in the armor of this complicated problem that we call racism? And what I've realized is in scientifically and critically examining the phenomenon of racism in its most severe forms, in its most minuscule and benign and weakest forms, the reality is that I've come to is that it is a part of a complex whole. And the complex whole is, to some extent, it's kind of a double-edged sword. The reason why we can never end racism is because race exists wherever people do. And people exist in spaces where they bring their race and racism with them and their racialized experiences wherever they go. And if, in accordance with our fundamental American values, we believe in the ideas of equality and freedom and justice, well, what is that going to look like on the racial front? And the only meaningful conclusion that I've been able to draw is that if I want to reduce racial inequality, then in order for me to reduce racial inequality, I actually have to be intentional about reducing it. And being intentional about reducing it means exploiting racism in order to reduce it. It means then being racially selective, being racially conscious, being racially aware, and with the goal being equality or reduction in difference, it should then theoretically be okay for me to use my racism to cultivate that equality and undermine the production of inequality. And that's the argument that I'm making. I'm not saying you need to agree with me. I'm not saying I win and we got to debate and blah, blah, blah. But what I'm hearing, it sounds like there are a lot of ways in which we actually agree.
I feel like I agree with you on pretty much all of what you're saying, except calling it racism on our end.
Mhm.
Um,
And
be
that's where a lot of people
and
have the contention. Yeah.
and so I feel like the only way that we would converge is once true equality actually happens. Until the scale is actually tipped and we are truly equal. And you don't do that until, like we said, we address the outcomes. But I don't think that it is racism
Mhm.
to 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 undo the racial harm that was done.
Right.
I think undoing racial harm is not racism. It's
Mhm.
leveraging the fact we're leveraging actual racism, which is systemic and institutional.
Yeah.
And well, let me not say actual because I'm not trying to like say
I,
that
I know what you
your
mean.
definition doesn't work.
No, I
But for
got you.
me, on my basis of like the what I think to is institution what racism is institutional power and
Mhm.
systematic harm to others to elevate
Mhm.
a singular race. And I
For
don't
sure.
think that actually doing that is because they actually have the institutional power. There is
Yeah.
institutional power, and
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
why the definition of whiteness is expanding,
Hmm.
and because it's to include more people in one group to exclude others in other groups.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that
we're
that is
we're
where
on the
we
we're on the same
diverge.
page in more ways than one. I would say the only way that we disagree is where a bunch of white people, including the Supreme Court, is saying that affirmative action is racist. Your response is no, it isn't. And my response is yes, it is. But that's literally the point. That's the only difference between you and me. Is I'm willing to go, yes, the reason why we're looking for diversified, qualified candidates is because we are undoing the racial harm. Oh, it's racist. Yeah, it is. That's literally the point. And that's where I stand on it is I'm not saying it's bigotry and prejudice, right? I'm making the argument that racism is not just bigotry and prejudice, but rather an agreement about who we're categorizing and how we're categorizing them based on a generally agreed upon understanding of race. And then we're making intentional strides to reduce the disparities where we are. And so, if at the end of the day, semantics is where we disagree, I'm glad that it's there because ultimately we agree on everything else. Um, but for me, I just think that in order for society to have more nuanced understandings of the complexity of race and racism, we kind of have to mature our understanding of racism a little bit. And it means reconceptualizing it in that, yes, racism can be bigotry and prejudice. I'm not saying it cannot be. I'm not encouraging people to be bigoted and prejudiced when I say everybody is racist. But what I am saying when I say everybody is racist is we all play a role in the game of racism. We all have a role to play. We all have an identity. We all sit at the table of the discussion. And because of that, we can't remove ourselves. So, where we can't remove ourselves, it's never going to end. It's just going to be how we play the game. And how we play the game is going to be understanding that we can leverage our racism as a tool for constructive contributions to the cultivation of a fair, just, and equal society. But it means that we really do have to reclaim this term and position it as a neutral capacity. And if you disagree with me on that, I encourage you to continue to disagree with me because you agree with me on everything else. So we can call it whatever we want to, but at the end of the day, we both agree that we're going to be intentional about reducing this shit. And if somebody comes and says to me, "Oh, Dr. Doyle, you're racist because you want fairness and justice and equality and you want to disrupt white supremacy," and yeah, that's the point. That's literally the point. Yes, I want more Black people in this space. I want more Asian people. I want more Muslims in this space. And if I have to be intentional about consolidating diversity in this space, and all you're going to call me as a racist, then yes, no, I'm not bigoted. I want these people. I think they deserve to be included. I think they need equal standing in society. I think they need the same wealth outcomes that white people have. I think we want to see the same rates of home ownership as white people. I think we need to be intentional about cultivating a fair, just, and equal society. And I'm willing to exploit the flaw in the game of racism, which just means being racially selective but not in a bigoted or prejudiced way. And that means playing the racism game too. And that's where I'm at. Okay. But yes. um, but Dr. Doyle is a racist in the same way that I'm saying everybody is. I'm just willing to own it, because in owning it, that means then that I can reduce the shame and the stigma that comes with the association of being a bigoted racist. But I'm not a bigot. Everybody has prejudice, but I'm not a bigot. I don't intend to be. I just think that if we want to cultivate a fair, just, and equal society, we're never going to get there by accident, and we're never going to get there by tiptoeing around the realities of racism. It really just requires admitting that we all have a role to play, and then once you understand the role that you play, how can you best play that role in order to cultivate the outcome you want to see? And that's where I'm at. But okay. This is where we're at. We've gone a little bit over the time, but I think this discussion is actually very important to the latter half of the lecture that we're going to cover in next week on Sunday when we finish this lecture, because the same way that we're having this conversation around the intricacies, and notice how we agree on certain things, but we have conflicts too. We disagree on other things. That parallels the relationship that we're seeing that plays out throughout history, right? And it's important for us to cover that. We're going to be touching back on this, and I will make the intentional effort to revisit this conversation. I hope that Tyrone and his wife come back next Sunday, because then we can revisit, reflect on this conversation, and then think about how it connects to modern society, right? And in the context of history. But we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for participating. Thank you so much for all of the important questions that you've asked. And yes, please come back. Please do. Okay. And then let's wrap up this lecture, and then I want to hear your thoughts on this, okay? As we get to the latter half of lecture. But you guys have a great Sunday night, and I will see you all next week. All right. Bye.